The geopolitical friction surrounding the conflict in Eastern Europe has recently escalated, characterized by an abrupt and significant application of diplomatic pressure originating from key political figures within the United States directed toward Kyiv. This tension centers on a particularly sensitive issue: the legal and political legitimacy of the current Ukrainian administration in the absence of a renewed electoral mandate, a topic previously deemed secondary to the immediate war effort.
Notably, former President Donald Trump, who in the past had dismissed suggestions from Moscow regarding the lack of legal authority of President Volodymyr Zelensky, has now demonstrably shifted his stance, actively urging Ukraine to proceed with organizing national elections even amidst the relentless fighting. This move is widely interpreted as a new form of strategic leverage designed to force changes in Kyiv's long-term diplomatic strategy. The rationale articulated by Mr.
Trump suggests that the continued suspension of elections, while justified by the extraordinary circumstances of war, fundamentally risks eroding the very democratic principles Ukraine claims to be defending. Speaking to Politico on the 9th of December, Mr. Trump's assessment was unequivocally clear, framing the situation as a critical time to hold elections, and adding the pointed observation that Kyiv's argument that the war serves as an excuse not to proceed means that at some point it stops being democracy. The severity of this statement lies in its direct challenge to Ukraine's foundational claim to legitimacy, potentially providing future diplomatic cover for those who might seek to bypass or undermine the current Ukrainian leadership. It is plausible that this sudden insistence on elections is not merely about democratic procedure, but rather functions as a mechanism intended to accelerate movement toward a specific peace framework favored by Washington, particularly one that may require difficult territorial or military concessions from Kyiv.
The timing of this pressure is crucial, arriving when internal dynamics in Washington regarding continued security assistance appear increasingly tenuous. However, the response from President Zelensky was perhaps the most unexpected element of this development, illustrating a dramatic tactical pivot aimed at reframing the negotiation. Within hours of the publication of Mr. Trump's critical remarks, the Ukrainian leader reversed his long-maintained and legally grounded position that elections are impossible while the nation is subject to martial law and continuous bombardment. On December 9th, President Zelensky publicly announced that he had instructed members of his political party to begin drafting the preliminary legislation necessary to allow for the organization of elections, even under active conflict conditions. This sudden willingness to contemplate a wartime election, previously deemed unthinkable by Kyiv due to the obvious logistical and security challenges, carries a monumental strategic caveat. The Ukrainian president explicitly linked this potential democratic exercise to receiving concrete, binding, and robust security guarantees from both the United States and its European partners. One highly probable interpretation of this maneuver is that President Zelensky is engaging in a high-stakes, calculated negotiation designed to exchange a highly sensitive political concession, the holding of elections, for immediate and vital national security assurances. By seemingly accommodating the American demand, abstract or undefined. The implication is profound. If the U.S. truly demands elections as a sign of democratic vitality, then the U.S. must first provide the necessary physical security for such a massive nationwide undertaking to proceed safely and credibly. This linkage is a critical move designed to force clarity and firmness from American policymakers who have, particularly under the shadow of a potential future presidential administration, maintained an ambiguous posture regarding long-term military support should a ceasefire materialize. Nevertheless, the legal and constitutional challenges inherent in this pivot are vast. Ukrainian law currently prohibits any nationwide voting while martial law remains in effect, a necessary measure implemented following the large-scale invasion in February 2022. To proceed, significant constitutional and legislative amendments would be mandatory, requiring broad political consensus during a period of national emergency. Beyond the legal hurdles, the logistical complexities raise profound questions about the fairness and integrity of any such vote. Considerations must be made for the millions of refugees currently residing outside Ukraine, the ability of frontline military personnel to securely cast their ballots, and the fundamental challenge of guaranteeing freedom of assembly and campaign speech in cities that remain targets of ballistic missile strikes and artillery fire. Therefore, while President Zelensky's tactical openness to elections successfully converts American pressure into a demand for security guarantees, this move simultaneously creates significant domestic political risks. A flawed or internationally challenged election process executed under duress could inadvertently lend credence to the very narrative of illegitimacy that Mr. Trump's initial comments seemed to endorse. This new diplomatic entanglement transforms the election issue from a purely domestic constitutional matter into a central hinge point of international negotiations, demonstrating the high wire act Kyiv is now performing to secure its future stability and defense capacity against persistent external pressure. The diplomatic entanglement transforms the election issue from a purely domestic constitutional matter into a central hinge point of international negotiations, demonstrating the high wire act Kyiv is now performing to secure its future stability and defense capacity against persistent external pressure. This pressure recently manifested directly when former President Donald Trump voiced his opinion, stating that this was a critical time for Ukraine to organize an election, implying that Kyiv was potentially using the ongoing conflict as an unjustifiable excuse to avoid democratic procedure, an assertion that challenges the fundamental legitimacy of the current administration. While Kyiv has consistently maintained that elections are impossible under martial law, President Zelensky's subsequent pivot signaled a profound strategic shift. On December 9th, he indicated that he had requested his party members begin preparing legislation that would potentially permit elections despite the ongoing Russian aggression, contingent entirely upon the U.S. and European partners providing absolute security guarantees. This statement represents a 180-degree turn from Kyiv's long-standing position and arrived just hours after Trump's pointed criticisms, suggesting the immediate linkage between the external political pressure and the sudden internal policy flexibility. Yet the logistical and legal barriers confronting Ukraine remain monumental, making the implementation of such an election within the suggested 60 to 90-day timeframe highly improbable, if not impossible. By Ukrainian law, elections cannot be held while martial law is in effect, a state declared shortly after the full-scale invasion in February 2022. Zelensky, whose original term would have required him to seek re-election in 2024, must first navigate a treacherous path that requires lifting martial law, amending the nation's constitution, and revising existing electoral laws, a process that in itself would require significant political unity and time, resources Kyiv can ill afford to spare given the war effort. Furthermore, the practical challenges of organizing a legitimate democratic vote during wartime are multifaceted and daunting. One hypothesis is that the process would face immediate legal challenges regarding voter access and fairness, as millions of citizens have either been internally displaced or have become refugees abroad. Ensuring the constitutional right to vote for military personnel actively engaged on the front lines presents an insurmountable logistical hurdle. International observers and Ukrainian officials have long asserted that proceeding with an election under these circumstances would be fundamentally unfeasible, arguing that the resulting vote would likely be viewed as illegitimate both by critics and by a significant portion of the populace, thereby unintentionally undermining the very democratic legitimacy Zelensky seeks to protect. In fact, internal resistance to the idea is substantial. A survey conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology in March indicated overwhelming public opposition, with approximately 78% of Ukrainians rejecting the idea of holding elections even immediately following a ceasefire coupled with security guarantees. The general consensus appears to be that the vote should only take place after a definitive peace agreement is finalized and the war is completely concluded. This intense domestic resistance reinforces the cautious perspective that Zelensky's sudden willingness to entertain the idea of wartime elections is less about practical implementation and more about diplomatic leverage. By publicly demanding that the U.S. and European partners guarantee security as a precondition for holding elections, Zelensky effectively turns an internal political problem, the question of legitimacy, into an external bargaining chip. It is likely that this tactic aims to force Washington, particularly the Trump camp, to commit to concrete, tangible security assurances for Kyiv, especially concerning military aid and defensive systems, before any discussion of a peace plan progresses further. This move forces the U.S. leader to reconcile his demand for democratic procedures with the cost required to make those procedures logistically feasible and secure.
The subtext of the negotiation suggests that if the West truly wants the election, they must first ensure Ukraine is strong enough to survive it. This strategic calculus positions Ukraine's democratic process not as an end goal in itself, but as a high-stakes currency in the complex geopolitical market. The ultimate success of this approach will depend on whether Kyiv can extract these necessary security guarantees without actually being compelled to hold an election that, given the current legal and logistical obstacles, would almost certainly destabilize the country. Ultimately, the question of the Ukrainian election resolves itself into a classic diplomatic exchange. Kyiv is prepared to discuss the possibility of the politically and logistically impossible election if, and only if, its Western partners are prepared to offer the one thing Ukraine needs to survive the war and secure its future: unbreakable, long-term security commitments, moving the focus away from internal political timing and onto external military sustainability.
The analysis and commentary in this video are based on publicly available sources and represent the channel's own perspective, reflecting the cautious, strategic interpretation of rapidly evolving diplomatic maneuvers in Kyiv, Moscow, and Washington.